No mai, haere mai. Welcome all. Tēnā tātou katoa and bula vinaka. Welcome to this webinar tonight, and we're really very, very happy that you've taken the time out of your day, wherever you are in the world. And I know we've got one from California and several from Fiji, so welcome all. I'm just about to, my name is Julie Haggie. I'm Chief Executive Officer of Transparency International New Zealand, and it's our pleasure to be partnering with the Brian Picot Chair in Ethical Leadership for this event as part of Victoria University Leadership Week. And I'm just about to hand over now to our session MC, who is James Bushell. James Bushell is a very busy man, and some of the things he's doing is he's director of MOTIF World Agency, which is a great agency, and he's also on the advisory board for the Brian Picot School of Ethical Leadership, and he's also a volunteer expert with Transparency International New Zealand, one of our members with delegated authority. So I'm now going to hand over to you, James, and off you go. Let's have a great time. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Kia ora koutou, bula vinaka, and welcome. It is my pleasure to chair tonight's webinar on modern slavery. Before I introduce tonight's panelists, I thought I'd just go through a little housekeeping. Down the bottom of your screen, you should see a few icons. One of them will say polling, and this is where we are holding a poll. And the poll is running on: what are you willing to do or give up to end modern slavery? You should also have a Q&A, and that is where you can ask the panelist questions. It will also have an upvote function where the questions, if you have a similar question or if you like a question, you should be able to upvote. With that being said, there's also a chat function where you can chat to the other people on the room. To introduce tonight's panelists, we have Becky Kingi from World Vision, who's going to be talking about what is modern slavery and what is the global vision. Elise Gordon from WalkFree, and she will be talking about what is the situation in Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific, and followed by Tod Cooper from Transparency International New Zealand, who will be talking about New Zealand's government response and transparency issues. So again, welcome. I'm very much looking forward to tonight's discussion, and I will pass it over to Becky Kingi to get us started. Thanks, Becky.
Thank you so much, James, for the kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me. Right, so we should be good to go. And yeah, just to echo again the comments that have already been said, thank you so much for inviting myself and World Vision to share this evening. And thank you to all those that are engaging with this and giving up your time to watch the panel and engage with the panel. I think it's really important, this issue, obviously, and so it's actually encouraging to see how much interest there is in modern slavery, and I hope that tonight's session is informative and yeah, that will continue to sort of grow your interest in this space. So I've got the tricky task, I guess, of laying the foundation for the night of what is modern slavery, what do we mean when we use this terminology, and actually what needs to be done to counteract this and to address modern slavery. I guess I just want to unpack very quickly a little bit of my background. So my background was as a New Zealand lawyer. I worked for a number of years in the UK representing survivors of modern slavery and human trafficking. And after that, I moved into the policy space. And I'll be honest, it's, actually seeing, firsthand what survivors have gone through and the deep-rooted issues that are in our communities and our society. It's given me a huge passion for this. And I'm really happy to be able to be working with World Vision and to sort of be working on this in the space in New Zealand, because actually this is a lot more connected to New Zealand than perhaps we realise. So moving straight into it, when you hear the term modern slavery, you'll probably find that there are a lot of terminology that's thrown around, and it can be really confusing when it comes to definitions. And, you know, in general, there isn't sort of like a formal global legal definition of modern slavery, but there's a sort of general understanding, and different jurisdictions also have within the domestic law kind of fleshed out what modern slavery means. But I think here a really good kind of succinct definition that we could use is the severe exploitation of people for personal or commercial gain. And on the slide here, you see I've listed a whole number of, I guess, forms of exploitation that often fall or are categorized within modern slavery. So we've got human trafficking, forced labor, the slavery of children, forced and early marriage, organ harvesting, forced criminality. We don't have time to go through each of these different headings and definitions tonight. Actually, you could do a massive seminar on each one, and I guess I just don't want to paint the picture that this can easily be packaged into one term. It's not. It's complicated, and it can look really different in different contexts, but we'll have a crack at kind of just laying a bit of foundation. So one term that I did want to pick out a little bit is because you'll hear it a lot is the term of human trafficking. So this is something that's generally accepted to fall within the terminology of modern slavery. And I've got here the definition from the Palmero Protocol. But I've broken that down into sort of more, it's a really mouthy, wordy definition. If you have a crack at saying that quickly, you'll find you get lost very, very quickly. But if you sort of draw out the key concepts, as you can see here on the right, we've got three main elements. We've got act, which is the movement, recruitment, transportation of persons. We've got the means, which is the control, so threat, use of force, deception, abuse of power or vulnerability. And we've got purpose, so the exploitation of that person. And that exploitation can take a number of forms. That could be sexual exploitation, that could be forced labor, that could be domestic service. And so that kind of can help you think about these three elements. A couple of, I guess, myth-busting things here. So for trafficking to have taken place, there doesn't need to have been the crossing of an international border. That can happen within a domestic framework. It can just be the movement of somebody from one place to another. And I think also important to note as well that actually for someone to be classified as a victim or survivor of human trafficking, the exploitation doesn't need to have actually taken place. They just had to have been, the act and means element for the purpose of that exploitation has to be found. And the last thing to remember as well, that for a child, child trafficking doesn't need that means element, just the movement for the exploitation. There doesn't need to have been that control or deceit for that threshold of trafficking to have been met. The other one I wanted to pull out, because you'll hear it a lot, and I'm sure it will come up, be quite, I think, the sort of main type of exploitation that we're talking about within the context of this webinar, and that is forced labor. So the UN Convention concerning forced or compulsory labor defines forced labor as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. And I've done the same thing here, and I've tried to break that definition down a little bit into like a more easy to understand, I guess, breakdown of the concept. So I think I've got here the means. So that's the threat of the penalty. And, you know, again, that deception or that abuse of power or vulnerability. And then we've got the service. So that can be, I guess, the type of exploitation or the means an individual provides a service for the benefit of somebody else. So here it could be manual labor, it could be begging, it could be sexual services, it could be domestic service. They could all fall under forced labor. I think also important to note that penalty, that word could be very like blatantly obvious, you know, that somebody is threatened, they have to do something, and it's a really, you know, a threat of physical violence. But often it takes a lot more subtle forms in a way that somebody is, that means element is met, and it could be the deception. So obviously lying about what's taking place, that abuse of vulnerability again. So knowing that that person has no other option, meaning that they're sort of forced to consent to this activity because there's no alternative. And it can be also psychological in nature, like threatening to turn that person over to authorities. Often there can be an abuse of someone's immigration or lack of immigration status. Or, you know, threat of turning them over to the police, which means there's that control and the person feels they have to stay in that situation, that they can't escape it. Again, for children, only the service element needs to take place. So for a child to be a victim of forced labor, there doesn't need to be that means element. So Modern slavery, I'm sure many of you are aware, actually, this is, this is a pressing issue of our time. In fact, I would challenge and say it's the pressing issue of our time. There are thought to be 40 million people estimated to be trapped in modern slavery worldwide, which is a really scary stat, right? Like, I think often we see that stat and we just get lost. We're like, it's so big, what can we do? I mean, we'll get to that. There's a lot that New Zealand can and should be doing, and we're behind our game, but, I'm sure we'll get more into those details. 71% are women and girls, and 1 in 4 victims are thought to be a child. And this does connect close to home. And earlier this year, World Vision has released research, and we found that 3.1 billion of risky products were imported into New Zealand in 2019. By risky product, I mean a product that, given the context with that product was produced and the supply chains associated to it, there was a high risk it was produced in the context of modern slavery. And we also found that on average, $34 each week is spent by the average Kiwi household on risky products. So actually this is, as much as we also have issues of domestic slavery within our country, the exploitation of people happening on New Zealand's shores, it's in our everyday household goods and items. And so it's something we all should be alive to, and it's something we should all be doing something about. It's not acceptable for this to be an issue of our society. So how do we deal with this? Obviously, I've just presented a huge problem, and actually I'm pleased to say I really do believe there are solutions and there are things that we need to be doing. However, I actually believe a holistic approach is what's needed to end slavery. There's not one tick box exercise that's going to get this, to be made history in our time. And actually, we need to be working together across industries, with communities. And I've just listed, I guess, some of the ways which we can address this. One of this is actually by recognizing and addressing push factors that cause people to be vulnerable to modern slavery in the first place. Here I've listed some. So poverty, it's like your inability to meet your basic needs. Discrimination, we saw just before in the stat that women and children are, the majority of people in these situations of exploitation. Immigration status, I talked about that, psychological control, but also it can happen as well to Kiwi nationals and nationals of a country as well. So it's not just a migrant issue. Lack of access to education and work, lack of access to rights. So that's access to justice, access to employment rights. Are really important in terms of addressing the actual causing factors of modern slavery. The protection and rights of survivors are extremely important, making sure that survivors are identified and also that they can access support and protection and access to remedy. Also, so people are confident to come forward and report when this happens to them. Supply chain due diligence, so working with corporate and the public sector. And I know many of my fantastic colleagues on this call are going to dive into this more, what these models look like and how they are effective and what the impact of them are. And also I put here criminal and civil justice. So we're talking here about making sure that there's both criminal and civil penalties here and able to get restitution for when this happens. I think that's all I've got time for. I'm going to wrap up soon. I guess I just want to say from World Vision's perspective, we are really passionate about the work that needs to be done here within New Zealand, in the Pacific region and wider at the side of the world. We see that as both the New Zealand government bringing in effective legislation. We support that and we are pushing for that. And we also see that in our programmatic work on the ground with communities, where we're trying to address some of these push factors that make people vulnerable to exploitation. So that especially for children, there is another route that children are able to stay in education and access, when they're older, appropriate and sustainable work that's good for their families and communities, that they're not going to be exploited. I've just left here my contact details in case you're interested in what World Vision are doing in this space and have any questions we can't address in the session. But thank you so much, and I'll hand over to some of my colleagues now.
Thank you, Becky. And we will circulate those slides. Elise Gordon, over to you.
Thanks, James, and thank you to Transparency International and the Brian Picot Chair of Ethical Leadership for having me. The Aussie ring in on the call, so I appreciate it. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Let me know if you can't see it. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Excellent. Okay, so in terms of our region and what modern slavery looks like, I just wanted to mention that modern slavery happens in all countries in the world, and and the countries of the Pacific region, our region, are no exception. So WalkFree in our 2018 Global Slavery Index report estimated that in Australia, there were some 15,000 people in modern slavery, in some form of modern slavery, on any given day in 2016. And in that same period, we estimated that in New Zealand, there were around 3,000 people in some form of modern slavery. We don't have estimates for the extent of modern slavery in the South Pacific islands and territories, unfortunately, as yet, but we do know that it exists. And so I really wanted to sort of break that number, well, maybe put some faces to those numbers. So what do these numbers actually look like in practice? So you may be aware of the recent case of modern slavery in New Zealand, where the Samoan chief, Joseph Auga Matamata, was convicted of slavery and trafficking offences, and he was jailed for 11 years for those offences. Now, this was a really horrible case. It involved the exploitation of 13 Samoans, one as young as 12 years of age. The exploitation happened over the course of 25 years. And I think what I really wanted to point out was that some of the elements of this case are really common across many of the modern slavery experiences in our region. So there's deception. So the victims were told that they would have legitimate work in New Zealand and would be paid a fair price. And instead they were made to work long hours, their pay was withheld, their movement was restricted and heavily monitored, they weren't able to contact their families at home, and there was verbal and physical abuse as well if they weren't working hard enough. And we know that this is just the tip of the iceberg. So majority of cases go undetected, let alone going to trial or ending in a conviction or any kind of justice for the victims, sadly. WalkFree did some research in 2019 trying to better understand what modern slavery looks like in the Pacific region. And what we found was that most forms of modern slavery were reported across the region. So, for example, we identified forced labour in the construction, horticulture, fishing and agricultural sectors. For example, I'll give an example from Fiji. Filipino workers had been reported to be in forced labour in the construction industry over there. Debt bondage in the fishing and horticulture industry was also identified. So this includes the debt bondage of migrant fishers, often from Southeast Asia, aboard tuna fishing vessels in Pacific waters. And often they ended up in debt bondage because they had to pay incredibly high recruitment fees to land a job. And then once working, they had to pay off these incredibly large fees before they were allowed to leave. And oftentimes, it takes months or years to be able to work these fees off. Debt bondage in the horticulture sector of Australia and New Zealand has also been identified, and this is sometimes our Pacific Islander neighbours who are the victims in these cases sometimes. Forced sexual exploitation and commercial sexual exploitation of children in hospitality and tourism sectors, in sex work, and in and around the extractive industries like mining and logging has also been identified across the region. So an example from the Solomon Islands is the commercial sexual exploitation of girls by males in the logging camps, which is often facilitated by male relatives of the girls who are offered cash and cigarettes and alcohol in order to arrange these transactional sexual relationships. Domestic work is also another sector which is high risk in our region. In 2019 in Australia, an Australian couple were jailed for the forced labour of a Fijian woman who was forced to work in their home for a period of 8 years. She had her passport confiscated and was unable to physically leave. So we know that these are high risk sectors. And then forced and early marriage, again, certainly happens in many countries across our region. An example from Papua New Guinea is customary marriage of children, which still does occur sometimes for children as young as 10 years of age, despite there being laws that mandate that the minimum age of marriage is 18. So as you can see, these examples illustrate that it's not a sort of while there are similarities among a lot of these cases, it doesn't always look the same in our region. And I think it also illustrates that, as with other regions in the world, modern slavery tends to occur in sectors that are characterised by a high migrant workforce, low skilled work, and often also are labour intensive. So these are just a few examples, but you can read more in our Murky Waters report, which I will link to in the chat. And I think I might have a couple more minutes, correct me if I'm wrong, James, but I just wanted to, and Becky gave a really great introduction to some of those push factors for experiences of modern slavery. And I think I just wanted to also mention that in the context of the Pacific region, there are also exacerbating factors. So, of course, being highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change and to the impacts of natural disasters, that often exacerbates displacement, affects people's ability to make a living because of things like soil intrusion into the land and inability to grow crops, as well as impacting governments' ability to provide and address some of these issues because of the impacts on their resources and also on infrastructure, government infrastructure. And of course, the big elephant in the room is the impact of COVID. So, I mean, we're seeing COVID having a clear impact on, for example, the hospitality sector, which is having a really detrimental effects on people's ability to make a living and pushing people further into poverty, which, as Becky said, is a real driver of modern slavery in our region and in the world more generally. And I think I'll probably leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Elise. Yeah, really insightful and some really powerful photos there as well, which, yeah, very similar to some of the photos I have. So it's, yeah, really frightening. Over to Tod Cooper from Transparency International.
Tēnā koutou, everybody. Ko Ngāi Tahu, ko Ngāti Pākehā Te Iwi, kei Transparency International Ue Mahi ana, Head Director O, ko Tod Cooper, taku ingoa, kia nui mihi kia koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So my name's Tod Cooper. I'm a director at Transparency International. I'm also Director of Procurement at Department of Corrections and Congress representative for the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. So this is something that cuts to the heart. So what I'm going to do also is try not to fail in sharing my screen. So can you see that up there now?
Yes, thanks, Tod.
Great. Okay. So if I just start off on this one, so it's great to hear Becky talk and set that foundation about those horrific statistics, really highlighting the problem of modern slavery, and at least sort of talking about the fact that it is a worldwide problem, sharing some actual examples, which really pull at the heartstrings in terms of the impacts these are having on societies and individuals and their families and whānau and children. So. So what are we going to do about it? And I think this is where I come into play. So at the moment in New Zealand, these sorts of social issues really cut to the value of what's important to New Zealanders. And embarrassingly, we've been really slow at reacting to this. And don't take this the wrong way, Elise. This is something that we shouldn't be following Australia on. We should be taking a real world-leading stance on this. We should be agile enough to do it. At the moment, sadly, we've got no modern slavery legislation. So we've got no sanctions on goods arriving from areas suspected of human rights abuses. So literally, we've done nothing from a governmental perspective. But there is a bit of a shift. And I think that's really important to sort of talk about. So, you know, historically, certainly over the last 2 to 3 years, we've had civil society banging on about how important this is. We've started to see businesses come on board, and this recent open letter from businesses, you know, just demonstrating to the government how important it is to them now from a moralistic stand, has really seen a lot of momentum shift within government. So, you know, there are promises from Minister Michael Woods earlier in the year that the government would look to introduce legislation, and he was ambitious in saying, you know, as early as the end of 2021. So, you know, I think we all have an obligation to keep government accountable to that promise. They have put out a draft, modern slavery statement where they're looking at 28 actions across sort of 3 areas. And if you see on this one, we've got prevention, protection, and enforcement. So they've got their 28 actions that sit across those 3 areas. This is a downloadable document from the internet as well, so I'll see if I can get some links also with the Transparency International so you can have a look. I've really broken that down from a pragmatic perspective into sort of 4 stages. So, you know, so you've got four main stages. So the first one is plan, and there are a few principles that come across this. So plan is really around getting a really good understanding of what your workforce planning is, your pre-procurement planning. So understanding labour rights, environmental standards that come into play, and what assurance measures you're going to have in place. Understanding the supply chain, you know, as Elise said, this is a worldwide problem. So we need to take a bit of a worldwide stance in terms of our planning. So that way, you know, we can understand what sort of assurance we need in that and what expectations we have on the suppliers. And that can come down to what are our expectations around codes of conduct. So then we move into the, you know, then we move into the source space. Oh, this is no longer working. I'll just talk to this one. So then we move into the source space. So the sourcing side of it is more around, you know, make sure we've got the right documents to be going out there, and we're setting those expectations up in our tendering. And then we get into the protection side. I think this is, you know, this is something that is new to a lot of people, certainly in the government procurement sector. So, you know, we spend from a government perspective $50 billion every year. That buys us a lot of influence in terms of changing behaviours and influencing the market. We combine that with Australia, we combine that with the United Kingdom, you know, we combine that with the United States of America. We start to get huge government spend influencing international markets in terms of behavioural change about what is not right. Now, from a procurement perspective, that's shifting from a traditional behaviour of the lowest price race to the bottom, and that really does drive exploitation and supply chains as businesses try to, you know, try to give us what we're looking for. So there's been a real shift in that one, and we're starting to see, you know, certainly from the New Zealand context. So we've got, you know, things like the broader outcomes and progressive procurement policy, and these are really driving a really strong social, economic, and environmental reset in the way that we procure our goods and services. So once you've got that monitoring, and you know, you're constantly looking at your supply chain, not only at the sort of tier 1, but the expectations around having visibility at tier 2 and tier 3, and pushing those onto those tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. I think the key thing, and this is a really challenging thing, you know, is how do you react? You know, how do you react? So if you use, for example, a tool like Ask Your Team, where you get employees to fill anonymously out sort of surveys in terms of how they're being treated. So once you get information where there's exploitation, you know, do you terminate the contract? How does that solve the problem? And this is the really challenging part. And this is a bit that there's no real silver bullet to this. You know, so it's really about not overreacting from a commercial perspective and trying to take a really collaborative approach to try and address the issue. And you know, there's a great example of, you know, if you find exploitation in a factory at tier 2 in your supply chain and you terminate that contract, you create 150 workers, you know, that were being exploited, and you turn them into into sex workers, and they'll be trafficked in another way. So, you know, you're solving one problem by potentially creating a worse problem. So I think the thing is about working collaboratively with your supply chain to address those issues if they, you know, if they become visible. So that, you know, because I'm conscious of time, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense around what's being done. I do have a few links, but unfortunately my screen is not working in terms of shifting forward. So that's probably it from me in terms of, I think my time is up. So any questions, let me know towards the end.
Brilliant, thank you, Tod. And so, yeah, with those questions, please answer them or ask those in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Polling should now be up as well, so please add your responses to the poll, and in 15 minutes we'll announce how that poll went and what we think are some of the most effective ways that we can combat slavery. Again, to all the panelists, thank you very much. It's really informative to understand your insights and just, I suppose, the nuances that come with modern slavery, and it maybe isn't as clear-cut as we'd all like it to be, and really understanding the situation before we act, how important that is, but also the urgent need to act and how invasive it is in our everyday lives. With that being said, Becky, one of your slides, $34 each week is spent on risky products. And I'd like to ask the question from Kay Jones. How can we find out if a product is made with slavery or coerced labour?
It's a fantastic question, Kay, and the problem at the moment is that actually it's very difficult to find out where our products come from in New Zealand because we don't have any legislation in place that requires due diligence to be done by companies and reporting to happen on that due diligence. So that's exactly why we're calling for this legislation, so that New Zealanders don't need to be buying in the dark. But, you know, we think it's we think as a consumer, your voice is important and your ability to make consumer choices. Equally, we think that the government and companies should be helping you to do that. And there's a responsibility from the New Zealand government to be actually have a centralized reporting system, for there to be obligations on companies to take these steps. And one thing I will say as well is that actually, I don't want the narrative to be that this is scary for business, because what this actually does, and actually putting these requirements in place, is it creates a level playing field in our economy. And at the moment, we have an economy that rewards people for cutting corners and treating people badly because it enables them to profit. When actually we want an economy that encourages sustainable, responsible business that's better for the workers and communities on the ground. It's better for Kiwis buying the products, and it's also better for our business environment that we're trading and working in.
Thank you, Becky. Elise, Tod, anything to add?
Yeah, look, I mean, Becky was sort of spot on. The fact that we don't have sanctions and we don't visibly, communicate when we have, when there is slavery within supply chains overseas, is a concern. And I think from a transparency perspective, we need to be much better at calling out these sorts of behaviours, these sorts of products, and these sorts of businesses. And like I said, if we can get this sort of reporting regime in place, then we create that transparency, and Kiwis can, and I hope they would vote with their wallet in terms of making that choice to go with ethical companies. And we are seeing that consumer change, that consumer behaviour change.
Yeah, and I think I'll just really quickly add, I agree with both Becky and Tod, and that consumers want this. Many businesses want this as well, as Becky said, for at least for a level playing field, if not because they want to contribute something good to the world that they operate in. And I think it's time for governments, not just the New Zealand government, all governments, to really enable that by putting in place legislation and policies that make it easier for for transparency to happen.
Thanks very much. I suppose the next question talks a little bit just to the nuances really. So the concept of the social gradient appears in the Marmot Review to express inequalities exist at different levels of society. How does the phenomena of wage slavery relate to this discussion, even for New Zealand-based jobs that are considered at face value to be legitimate and legal and subject to neoliberal thinking?
Do you want me to make a first comment?
Please, that would be great. Thanks, Elise.
Yes. So, I mean, we talk about modern slavery or forced labour in particular as being on a sliding scale of exploitation. So you're absolutely right. You know, I don't think you can just look at forced labour without also looking at labour exploitation. And, you know, while it's not necessarily as extreme as forced labour in some of these situations around underpayment, overwork and those kinds of things, it doesn't mean that it's not a serious issue that needs to be addressed. And I think by addressing, you know, the drivers of forced labour, we're also addressing the drivers of labour exploitation as well.
I completely agree with Elise, and when I look at the issue of forced labour and exploitation, I do see this on a scale. And if you think on the one end of the scale, you have labour rights that are upheld, access to remedy for workers and easy enforcement of rights. Then in the middle, you kind of start to go towards labour abuses. And that may be things like health and safety violations, you know, not complying with contractual terms. Maybe they're not even being a proper contract in place. And that gradient gets more and more severe. And I think actually a really key part of, you know, how I talked about a holistic approach of tackling this is actually in society, we need to be striving and upholding labour rights on this end, because that helps prevent things escalating to this end. So there does need to be that view that this is seen by as well. And actually the New Zealand government's plan of action does acknowledge and even I think use an image of that kind of scale, which is really positive to see the government recognising that there needs to be a holistic approach.
Thanks very much. Kia ora, Daniel King. Tod, quick question for you. Will AOG procurement be working together to address exploitation or work separately?
Well, 100% working together. So, you know, there's a lot of work being done, you know, a centre-led approach from the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment around, around getting us sort of fall behind those tools, templates and maturity to ensure we take a single view and a single approach. And I think, you know, for most procurement people that I talk to, you know, when you start to talk about the progressive procurement policy and the drive towards broader outcomes and what that means, you know, that is really driving a really sort of a really social currency approach to it. So yeah, it will be an all-in-one approach. Like I said, we have to combine $50 billion buys a big behavioural change. You know, and that's the direction we're trying to take.
Thanks, Tod. From anonymous attendee, how can grievance mechanisms help an organisation address modern slavery, and is it recommended?
Yes. Certainly. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think there are, it's not a silver bullet grievance mechanisms, but I think having an independent grievance mechanism is a great place for businesses to start in terms of identifying risks within their own operations and also in the operations of suppliers if there is a way to also ensure that there are grievance mechanisms within their supply chain as well. As I said, it's not a silver bullet. I think, you know, there are lots of barriers to people reporting some of these issues. A lot of it is around fear of losing a job, which, you know, as we spoke about before, people are often in really precarious positions because of their economic insecurity. And so, you know, it's not as easy as just making a complaint and then being confident. A lot of people, there's a lack of trust that will necessarily end the situation, and in many cases maybe it won't. So I think it's a great starting point, but there needs to be a whole suite of actions that business take in order to reduce the risks in their own operations and supply chains. Grievance mechanisms, just one of them.
And
I think just to add to that, Apple and Pear, for example, using anonymous surveys for staff, to fill out, and obviously whistleblowing and all that sort of adds to the tools where where you're starting to build a situation where workers can have a voice. They can put their grievances up, knowing that there won't be blowback on them for doing that, and and hopefully we can change a system where we will address those either independently or directly within an organisation, through through the right roles being created and to support the grievances.
Thanks, Tod. And just a follow-up question from me on that really is, if people or businesses are looking to improve their way of their systems and structures to deal with modern slavery, where can they go for advice on this?
I'm going to put something out there that perhaps there are so many places you can get good advice from, but in terms of thinking of mechanisms that can work for the workers, I would suggest asking the workers and working out, that grievance. For an example, I just want to give an example, I guess, tangibly of where there wasn't a grievance mechanism and how that can itself be a risk. So we did some research in an organisation I was based on in the UK in the cleaning sector around COVID cleaning, particularly because there was an exacerbated risk for workers in that sector. And sexual harassment was an issue, but there was no grievance for reporting sexual harassment. And so it meant for some workers, if they didn't respond to the sexual harassment, they would end up losing their shifts, their cleaning shifts. And so you can see it actually building into exploitation, not having those effective mechanisms. But what would work for those workers in terms of feeling confident to come forward and report? I think that they should be involved in some of those discussions and the community should be. However, again, holistic, there are so many great places to go to help. And I'm going to let my colleagues chip in on this because I know they'll have some really tangible examples.
I think it can be quite overwhelming for businesses because often there is so much information and it's not always practical. We'll just do a little spruik for WalkFree's website. We actually have a really great business hub on our website where we collate not our own tools, but tools from a range of different organisations that can help businesses to increase transparency in their supply chains and identify risks. So that's one place to go. And it would be fantastic to see, and this doesn't really answer the question, but it would be fantastic to see New Zealand, once the government passes supply chain legislation, really having some fantastic guidance around how businesses can do that as part of the process, which is something that Australia and the UK have done. So I'm sure that New Zealand will do it even better.
Yeah, and I think at least that that is starting to come, and I think there's an initiative, like I said, with MBIE and where they're starting to put that material up for businesses to start thinking about what they want to do, before the legislation is in place. We don't want to be reactive in this, and I think we're seeing that come through, quite strongly. Ultimately, some of these are tools, and there's plenty of material out there around, obviously, from yourselves, from World Vision, all that in terms of how businesses do it. There are plenty of consulting firms out there that will help to drive, modern slavery statements and what that means, and trying to recast their vision, values, and principles, around these sorts of things. But in terms of looking at the supply chain, again, tools that help you identify some of these red flags are important. There are international organisations that will, that will call out, businesses, and so it's just a matter of being able to tap in, and again, it's just where you look. The information is there.
Brilliant, thanks, Tod. So just letting you know, we'll do one more minute on the poll, and then we will announce what the poll results are, and then we will continue the discussion on those poll results and also any other questions. But before we announce the poll results, I'll ask one more question from Graham, and that is there an example of a modern slavery law that is accepted as best practice that countries like New Zealand could use as a starting point, and what countries are doing particularly well here?
Perhaps I could share some experience from the UK, and then I know obviously Elise will have a lot of experience from the Australian sector, but I guess I want to emphasize that maybe where the UK and the Commonwealth have been at for me is a starting point, and it's been really positive that the UK did bring in the Modern Slavery Act, and it was held to be, you know, an amazing step forward in this movement. But in terms of the transparency provisions, particularly, there was a lot of work to do, and initial analysis of the Act, once it had been enforced for a number of years by an independent organisation, found that only, I think, 2 out of 5 companies that should have been complying with that provision were. And there were some real, you know, obvious reasons for this. Partly it was because there was no central reporting system. It was just left to civil society to actually monitor what was going on. So there's not a lot of incentive for compliance. There were no penalties. There was no, you know, not a single injunction was put against any of those companies that didn't comply. Also, there was not enough clarity around what companies were supposed to do, which the Australian Act has improved on. I'll let Elise touch on that in terms of actually being specific about what is required to discharge the obligation. What I will say though is the UK's Modern Slavery Act is, you know, that section itself has been reformed and there are improvements, but I strongly believe New Zealand can do a lot better. We can also look at what our European colleagues are doing, and they're actually bringing in due diligence provisions, and we've just seen law passed in Norway and Germany in June, and I could spend a long time talking about those laws, but maybe give them a Google to see what actually is being done by Europe. And I think, you know, we need to have our eyes open in New Zealand. It's not just about being compatible with the UK and Australia, but also our European I guess friends as well, because, you know, we want to be consistent with what's going on there, and I hope even better.
Yes, we hope that too. Over here in Australia, we want to see New Zealand do much better. Yes, I think the UK Modern Slavery Act was a great starting point. The Australian Modern Slavery Act has tried to improve on that using lessons learned from the UK case study. One thing that was really great about the UK legislation is that they built in a review, so that you know, after a period of years, there was it was required to, you know, basically touch base, see how it was going, what were the gaps, what was going well, what wasn't going well, how can you improve it. One of the things that the Australian legislation has done is have the central repository, which Becky was talking about, which houses the statements that businesses have to make. The threshold is a little bit lower for Australian businesses, and I think it's important to you know, ensure that, you know, we're capturing all major businesses so that we can kind of have that tipping point effect. And I think, you know, what we would really like to see is penalties for businesses not reporting under the Act if they're required to do so. That's certainly, I agree, somewhere that we're falling short in that regard.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think we've got that advantage of not being the first mover on this. So, you know, if we don't improve upon, you know, Australia, we don't improve upon the UK, then we've missed the boat on that one. And I think, like you said, the penalties is a big one, and I know that's, you know, a lot of criticism that comes out of the Australian one is there are very little consequences for failing to adhere to it. So, you know, we certainly want to get the right, and I think we need to take a, you know, instead of adopting the same as the UK, we need to really look at what works for the New Zealand environment and size it appropriately and communicate it appropriately so it works really well for us. That would be my take.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you to everyone watching and for submitting your poll answers. What we're going to do now is the panelists, if they click on the polling down below, they should be able to see the polling results. And we're going to open it up really for a conversation about what some of these results are. And I think for me, it's interesting about, you know, what are the easy things to do and what are the challenging things to do. It's really positive to see at 77%. I will talk with other people to raise more awareness about modern slavery, which I think is really promising. One of the lower ones, sitting at 38%, is I will protest and demand action from government to do more to end modern slavery. I thought I might open that up to the panelists as to what role do we have as citizens to advocate for this with our government and representatives?
Well, I think a huge role. I mean, ultimately, when it comes down to it, we're a democracy. The voice of the people is what matters the most. So, you know, I mean, I was surprised to see that as low as it was, and maybe that's because there is, you know, a lack of understanding of what modern slavery is, and this is something that happens overseas and not in New Zealand. And I think there's an educational piece around that. But ultimately, you know, the government work for the people. So, you know, if from a groundswell perspective, this is what we want, this is what will happen. And like I said, we're seeing the change because not only you've got civil society, but you've got businesses starting to bang on. Now, you know, if we start to see the Joe public bang on about this as well, then, you know, you'll see it accelerate. So you'll see faster action.
Yeah, I agree with Tod wholeheartedly on that one, that I think certainly we need consumer voices to be louder. And I agree that it's probably part of the reason that it is quite, the response is quite low, is around maybe not knowing that it is a significant issue that impacts, you know, Australia and New Zealand and other more developed countries. I think linked to that is it's also, the response was quite low with regards to asking political parties and representatives to undertake action. So that's obviously quite well linked to, you know, demanding government action. And it's such an important avenue to call for change, to actually really let your local member know that this is an issue that's important to you, and also, you know, vote for the people, those representatives who you know, advocating for policy change which will improve labour rights and will bring in legislation which will level the playing field for businesses in terms of supply chain transparency, and do want to bring in legislation that, for example, you know, stops imports of goods with high risk of forced labour at the borders, these kind of things. So I think, you know, I understand that why there are some reasons why that might be low, but I think, you know, it's really important to let the government know that this is an issue that is important to you.
Just to echo that as well, I think sometimes it can seem a bit scary, and like, this isn't, you know, asking anybody to, like, you know, stay overnight at the bottom of the beehive necessarily in order to get government attention, but I completely reiterate what Elise and Tod have said, and just to give some really tangible things that you can do to show your MP and government that you care about this. You can write to your MP, and usually the MP has their email address. If you just Google your MP, that will come up how to contact them. If that's too much work, I think you can tweet or tag your MP on social media. Say you've been to this event and, hey, you really care about this. Hey, can you get involved? Actually, the government at some point, I really hope that they will open this up to public consultation. And that's something that you can contribute to as a member of the public, and say that it's important to you that the government prioritize this. And not to underestimate actually how important as a New Zealander your voice is to government, showing that this should be a priority for them on their agenda. Governments have a lot of things on their books that they need to get across. So actually a public, you know, showing that the public are interested, engaged, and want action is really effective.
Thanks, that's really useful. One of the things I was quite positive to see is also just some of the support for the organisations in this room. Again, you know, it can be quite confronting to put yourself out there, and so being able to, you know, be part of a network and an action. I was wondering if you'd be able to speak a little bit to, you know, with the organisations that you're representing today. How can people get involved with what you're promoting and what you're trying to achieve?
I can start us off and obviously give time for my colleagues on the call, but yes, absolutely would really welcome. It doesn't even just need to be financial support to our programs on the ground. Of course, that is welcome. But if you're not in a position to give, or you don't want to give, you're still welcome to be involved in what World Vision are doing in this space. And we want to equip you to help you become more aware of these issues, I guess, educate on what they mean for you as a New Zealander and the context that we work in. And I guess hope activate you to kind of make some steps of action. And maybe some of those steps are the ones listed in the poll. So something that you can do is check out out our advocacy page on our website. And I think what we're going to be introducing soon over like the course is actually a bit of a journey for people to subscribe onto, so we can talk about these issues and help with that education awareness process. You are very welcome. And yeah, would be great to kind of continue this relationship, I guess, because it's actually really important for us that, you know, we don't see ourselves as doing this just as an organization. We see ourselves being a voice for the communities on the ground and for the supporters and the public in New Zealand that are engaging with us on this issue.
Elise, yeah. So from a Transparency International perspective, obviously as a global organisation as well, you know, we have the New Zealand chapter. So good ways to get involved at the start is to, you know, just join our newsletter and just be vocal with us and you know, get that two-way dialogue going. And if you see value, become a member, which helps to support us and get involved in some of the initiatives that we're, you know, that we're pushing forward. You know, the latest one, for example, FISA around driving, you know, awareness of the financial integrity within our financial systems. And so, you know, good organisation. But I think it starts with us, you know, with a newsletter and potentially, yeah, becoming a member. And then eventually, if you want to get really involved, you know, join as a member of delegated authority. I know James is involved in that, and then you eventually might want to become a director.
Thanks, Tod. Elise, how can people get involved with and support the work that WalkFree is doing?
Well, certainly following our research reports and informing yourself about what are the latest trends in modern slavery. We've got our next Global Slavery Index that's coming out next year, and we also have the next Global Estimates of Modern Slavery, which we produce in partnership with the International Labour Organization and the International Organization for Migration, which is coming out early next year. So we'll have some updated figures on the extent of the issue. And I think really using these to yeah, chat to your friends and your family and let them know the significance of the issue. And I think then, you know, in whatever role you take in society, whether it's as an investor, as a business person, as a voter, as a consumer, you know, get involved on the issue. And I think WalkFree will be very, very grateful if you do that.
Brilliant, thank you. One of the questions from Shamila is, how does modern slavery differ from slavery of the past?
Really good question. And I think, you know, it often gets talked about in in the same sentence sometimes. So I think it can be a little bit confusing. Slavery of the past is very much about, you know, physical shackles almost. And while modern slavery, there can be that physical element of coercion, often it's not. And so I think it's important, it's often more subtle and not as obvious, modern slavery. So, you know, it is around, and, you know, Becky talked about that, you know, psychological coercion and those kind of things that keep people in situations of modern slavery. And you know, I think that's the main issue, is that it doesn't have to be physical confinement or physical restrictions to be considered modern slavery.
Yeah, just to comment, I agree with Elise. And I think one of the really actually scary things about modern slavery is that this isn't new, what's happening. It's just suddenly got kind of a lot more data and research and understanding in the last couple of decades, to be honest. And that's part of the inherent evil to me, that this has been so easy to hide in a way. And part of that is because of the lack of legislation around transparency and reporting, and us having, you know, really good systems in place to address this. That's part of the problem and why it has been hidden. But that's not in any way to say that this hasn't been around. Unfortunately, you know, it's been part of the way that we've been running things, and that's why it needs to stop.
Thanks. Yeah, one of the questions that's been raised, and we talked a little bit about it just in terms of climate and how that's influencing more people, but how people can it's quite difficult to monitor when you're looking at the international marketplace. So a question from Omar is, different countries have different labour and employment laws and their national standards. Also, importers are looking for cheap labour costs. So how can we monitor the international arena?
Yeah, I mean, if I just jump in history on this one, so when when I talked earlier about understanding your international market, so you really need to leverage what foreign bodies what offices you've got over there. So for New Zealand, for example, we have missions in many countries around the world that we can leverage in terms of understanding local labour laws, and that so that we can work within those and understand them, because everyone's going to be different, and we're not going to pay a New Zealand living wage if we're recruiting from a supply chain overseas, because it throws their whole market out. So it's about really understanding. It's about really understanding, and like I said, it's about ensuring that you're putting the right mechanisms and due diligence in place. That's probably the starting point. Is it probably an area where Elise is pretty strong with WalkFree?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like you don't want to address the issue just in one location and then it to be displaced into another country. Like you might stop sourcing goods from Xinjiang in China, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not still happening in another location and people are sourcing goods from other high-risk areas or other high-risk sectors. So I think it's really about this trying to bring all governments on board to really try to reduce the risks in their countries. That is obviously a massive thing to do, and I think and again it comes back to asking your government representatives to have those diplomatic meetings and call on other countries' governments to improve labour standards, and come together with other countries in your region or outside of the region, and have agreements around labour practices and things like that. And I think it's a long road, but that doesn't mean we can't make huge improvements if we really make a concerted effort to bring everybody on board.
Absolutely, and I think that's why there is a huge point to say, as New Zealand, we do need to clean up our own backyard, because we do need to be really, I guess, encouraging in our diplomacy and our international relations for labour standards to be upheld and to be improved, as well as human rights across the board. But if we're not upholding them in our own country, how can we be in a position to say that? So, I do really think that part of good international raising of standards means addressing your domestic standards.
Brilliant, thank you. And a question, kia ora David, from David Duncheath. What progress is required to New Zealand visa legislation to substantially reduce the likelihood of visa holder exploitation?
Is that question about the changes that are being introduced by NBIE? Have I understood that right?
But do you want to give us a bit of an update as to what some of those changes are?
I understand that there's been an introduction of a 6-month visa that's accessible for a worker that reports exploitation. My understanding, though, is that there are still, in my mind, a few issues with that visa, because I believe at the end of that 6-month period, they need to have secured another work visa that's again tied to an employer. So I have an issue with worker visas that are tied to an employer, because I think that creates a breeding ground for exploitation, unfortunately. I also have an issue with people on work visas that come in and aren't able to access any of the safety nets of our society, despite being paying tax and being contributing to our economy, because that to me is a push factor. If somebody can't access housing or employment support while they're trying to find another job, then they're going to be more likely to stay with their exploitative employer, because otherwise they're going to be destitute. So actually, my recommendations for immigration visas to protect those that are identified and come forward as survivors of exploitation is that they should be then given an extension of a visa that's for the whole period of the initial grant that came through, that isn't tied to any particular employer. so that they don't end up in a similar situation, or they don't end up having to be removed or return home despite this terrible thing happening on our country, and they can continue to contribute to the economy and continue to send money home to their family, or for the reasons that they came in the first place. I also think, I'll add on to this as well, that this needs to be done in contingency with access to remedy through the employment tribunal. It's not just about criminal prosecution, which though is very important, but an employee in this country, if they haven't been paid properly and they've been treated badly, they should be able to access those lost wages so they actually have remedy for what's happened to them. And we should be making sure that there's a really easy mechanism for that to happen.
There's not much you can add to that, Becky, but other than to say, we should have learned a lot during COVID with the vulnerabilities of a lot of our migrant workers, who were stranded in New Zealand without any support mechanism, and a government unwilling to budge on that. And, we certainly don't want to see, new visa rules basically, replicate that issue in a long-term basis. So, I certainly support Becky's view.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well, Todd. I agree. In Australia, we had a similar situation in terms of, having our, Pacific Island workers, over on seasonal work permits, who were stranded in Australia without access to support services, and that obviously, echoes a similar situation to New Zealand. And I think it's also really important to have pathways to permanency and citizenship as well, because in many cases it's an expired visa that unscrupulous employers use to hold over the heads of workers and threaten them with deportation basically if they don't do what they're asking. So I think that's also a big one as well.
And we've got one last question from Doug Adam, which is, what is the experience so far from the UK and Australian modern slavery legislations?
I think we touched on that a little bit briefly in the conversation, but I guess just to recap. So I know in the UK, the legislation was brought in and it addresses quite a broad spectrum of things. So it sort of really sort of consolidates the criminal definitions and also the I guess the terms of imprisonment if you are convicted of trafficking. It brings in a really, which I think is a really positive thing, a defense for somebody that is exploited criminally. So an example of that is in the UK, a lot of Vietnamese children or nationals can be exploited and forced to grow cannabis. And that's a criminal offense, right? Obviously the production of drugs. But if it's found to be in connection to trafficking, this triggers a defense so that they don't end up with a criminal record. A criminal record is another thing that can drive somebody into exploitation because it's so hard to get a job. So that's a really positive thing. That it creates a provision for an independent anti-slavery commissioner. I would be really pro an independent anti-slavery commissioner being in place in New Zealand. I think it's a really valuable, I guess, an asset for the sector to have, as long as that role is independent. And there has been, interesting debate in the UK about the independence of the role because of it sitting with the Home Office, a conversation for another day. But the current independent anti-slavery commissioner has done some really positive work, and as had her predecessor. And it also provides, obviously, the stuff we talked about tonight, the supply chain, the reporting. It really encompasses a lot, and it's a great starting place, but there is much more work to be done. We have a lot more research, understanding and learnings from what's taken place in that jurisdiction and others, and so hence a great opportunity to provide something for a New Zealand context that's really impacting and effective.
Yes, totally agree with that. And in terms of the independent commissioner, I think that's something that the Australian legislation is really lacking, having that independent person that really oversees the national strategy to address modern slavery. And so looking forward to seeing New Zealand having an independent commissioner as part of their legislation as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Just thank you, Becky, Tod and Elise for joining us on the panel today. Some really insightful comments, certainly improved my understanding and knowledge of modern slavery. And also I think some really tangible actions that we can take out of this. Thank you also to everyone that has joined us this evening from all around the world. yeah, we really appreciate the support and your interest in modern slavery, and it's great to see the poll and the actions that everyone is prepared to take to address something that is so pervasive in our society, and how deceptive it can be, and how it continues to change names and make its way into a society. So I really appreciate everyone joining us and discussion. And I will hand over to Julie, who will do a final wrap up. So thank you once again from me, from the panelists, and look forward to catching you on another panel discussion at some stage.
And thanks very much, James, for guiding us, being our helmsman tonight. That was a really great job. So just before people leave, Lindsay's going to share a link through to a Give a Little page, which is called, the money would go to Friend Fiji, which is a great organisation in Fiji, who are also distributing packages of support to migrant workers in Fiji, along with other people. We know that the people in Fiji are doing it really hard, and we thought as a way of sort of directly thanking us, it would be a way to actually give something to also to these organisations, this organisation in Fiji, through that link, which is a New Zealand-based organisation, Becca, raising some money, and they'll pass it on to Friend Fiji. So just thought I'd hand that on. So I just, as people are going, thank you so much, and haere rā, hoama, and also mose to our Fijian friends, and to everybody. Thanks very much, and we look forward to holding another one in the near future. Thank you very much also to Karen Lustfesen from Victoria University, Brian Picot Chair in Ethical Leadership, for helping us get this going and being part of it. Okay, bye y'all.